National Geographic published an issue exploring two different futures for our planet. One view presented what the Earth will look like in 50 years if we do nothing substantive about climate change. The writer described a grim, dangerous world of mass extinctions, searing forest fires, deadly heat waves, fierce storms, and widespread suffering for the human race. The other view portrayed what the Earth could look like in 50 years if we harness our time, ingenuity, resources, and technology now to undo at least some of the damage we've already done. We'd find sustainable ways to feed ourselves, clean up our oceans, rivers, and lakes, provide carbon-neutral energy for all. We'd reimagine our homes, streets, cities, and corporations in light of the most pressing needs of the environment. We'd begin to reverse climate change and prevent most extinctions. It's impossible to know who is right. Editor Susan Goldberg wrote, "Everything will depend on the decisions we make in the coming months, years, and decades." In Matthew's story this week, Jesus tells the chief priests and elders a parable about some tenants who make decisions rooted in greed, disrespect, and selfishness. A landowner lovingly planted a vineyard, leased it to some tenants, and traveled to another country. When harvest time came, the landowner sent his servants to the vineyard to collect his share of the produce. But the tenants seized the servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned the third. In response, the landowner sent a second group of servants to the vineyard, but the tenants killed them as well. Finally, the landowner decided to send his own son into the fray to reason with the tenants. Surely, he thought, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the heir of the vineyard approaching, they hatched a plan to murder him and claim his inheritance. So they seized the son, threw him out of the vineyard, and took his life. Jesus concludes the parable with a question for the chief priest and the elders. When the landowner returns to his vineyard, what will he do to those tenants? Jesus tells this story to indict the religious leaders of his day for exploiting and mistreating God's people, God's vineyard. The parable is meant to expose the corruption of the religious elite and condemn their obsessions with privilege and power. Jesus implies that the chief priests and elders are like the wicked tenants. They abuse their authority, dishonor God's house, and mistreat both God's messengers, the prophets, and God's Son, Jesus. At the heart of this parable is a distinction that I think speaks very pointedly to our current environmental crisis. What the tenants in the story neglect to understand, or deliberately choose to ignore, is that they are stewards rather than owners of the vineyard. When the landowner asks for his rightful share of the harvest, the tenants take offense as if the vineyard belongs to them. And it's the landowner who's in the wrong for making a claim on the land at all. Somewhere along the way, the tenants have forgotten their standing in relationship to both the land and the landowner. They've forgotten that they own nothing at all. Everything belongs to the landowner. Theirs is not a vocation of ownership. It's a vocation of caring, tending, and cultivating on behalf of another. Jesus doesn't describe the evildoers in the story as thieves or marauders. They're not outsiders. They're the landowner's trusted tenants. He chose and granted them creative license to steward the vineyard for the benefit of all. Many of us, like the tenants in the parable, have deluded ourselves into thinking that we own the earth and all that's in it. when we are meant to be stewards only? Haven't we, like the tenants, assumed that God is absent, apathetic, or uninvolved, and hoarded the beauty and bounty of creation for our own gain, comfort, and convenience? Haven't we, like the tenants, ignored and even maligned the countless messengers who've warned us over the past many years that our rapacious relationship with the planet will lead us to destruction? The truth is, we humans crave ownership. We like possessing things and controlling things. We like believing that things exist primarily to please, feed, entertain, empower, and protect us. We're rent-to-own folks by both temperament and preference. The idea that we don't in fact own anything offends us. Stewardship offends us. It insults our sense of entitlement, threatens our identity as consumers. People are actually going to court because they want to own their view, meaning the narrow slice of Pacific Ocean visible outside their living room windows. There are people who are actually fighting over who owns the 500-year-old redwood tree on the border between their properties. What does it mean to own the sea? What does it mean to own a tree that existed before your great-grandparents were even born? A tree that will outlast your great-grandchildren by centuries. When it comes to the earth, the bottom line is crystal clear in the Bible. We are not owners. We are caretakers of a vineyard God cares about deeply. A vineyard that will not thrive or even survive if we continue to treat it as a cheap and inexhaustible commodity. California is only halfway through wildfire season, and they've already lost over 3.5 million acres, along with countless homes, neighborhoods, lives, and livelihoods. Just a few days ago, the sky in the San Francisco Bay Area turned a bizarre shade of blood orange from the smoke pollution. They literally couldn't breathe the air outside their homes for weeks. I want very much to believe in the optimistic half of the National Geographic article. As a Christian, I do believe that the earth will be renewed and restored, that somehow God's coming kingdom will bring healing to all, even to all of creation. But I don't for 1 minute believe that we as stewards are somehow off the hook. Our vocation is lifelong, and our relationship to the landowner is eternal. I read an article about a young woman named Quanah Chasing Horse, who lives in Fairbanks, Alaska. In the past year, Chasing Horse, an 18-year-old Gwich'in and Oglala Lakota Sioux teenager, has traveled coast to coast advocating to protect her homelands from the desecration of oil drilling with her mother, Jody Potts, who is a Han Gwich'in and a tribal member of the native village of Eagle. Her mother also serves as the regional director for Native Movement and is a board member with the Alaska Wilderness League. They represent the fight to protect their state's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge is hailed for its immense ecosystem of nearly 20 million protected acres with sweeping tundra, glacial-fed rivers, and mountain ranges providing a sanctuary for wildlife, especially the 200,000-strong porcupine caribou herd. Before the region was deemed a wilderness refuge by the federal government in 1960, it was known by the Gwich'in as the sacred place where life begins. The name refers to the calving grounds for the porcupine caribou on the coastal plain, whose migratory path the once nomadic Gwich'in followed and still guides the Gwich'in today. This region has been home to local indigenous communities for millennia. Their lives, culture, and identities are inextricably tied to the well-being of the land. The Arctic, dubbed ground zero for climate change, is warming at a rate twice as fast as the rest of the world. The region is at even greater risk since the unprecedented decision by the Trump administration and congressional Republicans to open the refuge's coastal plain to oil and gas development. In August, the Interior Department formally announced its leasing program to open about 1.5 million acres of the refuge to drilling. But Gwich'in women are leading an intergenerational movement to defend the refuge from oil rigs and wells, all while championing indigenous rights and justice for missing and murdered indigenous women. Since she was 17, Kwana has traveled with a number of these women to speak with senators on Capitol Hill. She credits the teachings of elders and women in her life for her sense of purpose. My mom has always taught me to remember who you are and where you come from. As Kwana wrote in a poem, I'm from the beaded moose hide in modern clothes, from the smell of sage and taste of fry bread. I am from the fireweed trails, from the birch trees I used to climb, whose limbs I remember as though they were my own. I'm from the mushing, hunting, fishing, and berry-picking trips, from the family of traditions. I'm from the potlatches and the legends our elders tell. The reason I am the way I am is because my mom, grandma, and aunties have always taught me not to take shit from anyone, to do the best for our people, sticking up for our rights and our lands. I've learned a lot from the women in my life, she says. Kwana was raised in the movement, where over the years she heard her mother and the powerful women in her auntie squad talk about activism and the fight for the land. Climate change is rapidly altering this landscape. In the article that I read, Joy Potts, Kwana's mother, talks about the legacy that land her mother gave her holds for her. The locals call the spruce and birch drunken trees in that area because of their twisting, toppling forms caused by melting permafrost. The mountains and sloping hillsides are marked with swaths of tree spires blackened by wildfires that continue to worsen from record-breaking summer heat. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline close by is a stark reminder of the fossil fuel industry's threatening presence on the land. My grandmother picked this piece of land during the land allotments because of the cranberry bushes and the river, says Potts. In 2003, the wildfires burned the cabin to the ground, and I've been rebuilding the place since. I would come home from my shift at work at night, and that's when I would mush. It would be 40 degrees below zero, and that's when it's the most quiet, too cold even for wind. The kids would be in bed, and I would be hooking up the dogs out front, when I would hear the door open, and Kwana would come running outside to join me. She was just 9. I always had a caribou hide for her. She would bundle up in the sled, and we would talk as the dogs wove through trees. I just loved the sound, the crunching of the snow, the dogs breathing. It is so peaceful, mushing out on the land. She reflected on the greed and exploitation of sports hunters who collect moose and caribou's large antlers only, leaving their carcasses to rot. It's our food. which is what hurts us so bad, she said. These encounters of greed and disrespect are also the stories of climate change, the notion that the natural world is for the taking without responsibility or reciprocity. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, living off the land has become more critical than ever for the Gwich'in. The pandemic has caused a shortage of flights that usually import food into remote villages. At the same time, climate change is affecting hunting, fishing, and berry seasons. Things are becoming dire. I feel like right now we are deprived of our traditions and what we love the most because of the pandemic, Quanah said. We haven't been able to hunt this year in Fort Yukon. People were barely able to fish. Some people went out for weeks and returned only with 5 fish. That's all we live off of. My whole family depends on living off of food from the land. Moose, fish, and berries sustain us all winter. This year we won't have much. Growing up, I was always told we should not destroy the land. The elders always said we will fully depend on the land one day. Now with the pandemic, I can see what the elders mean. For several years, the Gwich'in have had meetings with representatives of major banks to urge them not to finance oil drilling in the Arctic. Their efforts have paid off. Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Citi, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Morgan Stanley have committed to no longer backing Arctic drilling projects. The Gwich'in maintain drilling in the refuge would be akin to cultural genocide. How could the caribou survive seismic blasts, oil rigs, oil spills, loud machinery, and migratory routes severed by haul roads and pipelines? With a rapidly melting permafrost that collapses the ground and drying tundra that spurs wildfires, the Arctic can't bear the slightest risk of industrial disaster on its already fragile lands. The Arctic is not simply ground zero for climate change because of record-breaking heat, accelerated permafrost, and glacier melt. It's also a landscape that represents the larger story of climate change. A land fraught with a history of indigenous displacement and dispossession, and ongoing colonial violence driven by insatiable corporate greed. These are the systemic forces driving the climate change. But to paraphrase writer Terry Tempest Williams' book on erosion, our undoing may be our becoming. The power of the youth vote is reason to hope. In the upcoming election, 1 in 10 voters will be Generation Z. The Brookings Institution reported that Gen Z and millennials now comprise a greater share of the eligible voting population than ever before. By 2030, millennials and their juniors will make up more than half of not just the population, but of all eligible voters. Quanah says, I'm just trying to stick up for our ways of life. They're just tearing up more land, destroying more water, and in the end, when all of the oil is extracted out of Alaska, what are they going to do? We need to reconnect and rebuild our relationship to the land. If all of this were to be destroyed from drilling and oil spills, I don't know how I would feel connected anymore. I don't want that taken from us. So I'm going to fight. I'm going to take care of the land. We own nothing. Not this planet, not our ministries, not our churches, not even our own lives. We share it all with one another. We share it all because that is how God intended for us to live. We're the tenants who are responsible to God, responsible to God's creation, and responsible to those who live here now and those who will live here down the road. We're the stewards, the ones who tend and nurture. And what it really comes down to is that we just work here. What it really comes down to is that we just work here. The vineyard belongs to God. Thanks be to God. Amen.